"You're not my son," David screamed, his face red with rage. His hands trembled as he held the envelope in his hands. He stared at the DNA test results, which confirmed what he had feared all along. The results were inescapable. The young man standing in front of him was his biological son. But David, his heart filled with hate and disgust, refused to accept it. I don't care what that paper says," David shouted again, his voice shaking. "You'll never be my son, not now, not ever." Jason, the 19-year-old standing before him, was in shock. His whole body froze. The man he had called dad for so many years, who had raised him, cared for him, and been there for him through every birthday, every graduation, was now rejecting him with no second thought. His chest felt tight, like someone had punched the air out of him. Why? Why are you doing this?" Jason whispered, unable to stop the tears that began to sting his eyes. David's eyes narrowed. "Because you're nothing but a mistake, Jason. I should never let her keep you. I should known better." Jason's heart pounded in his chest as David threw the DNA test results to the floor. They fluttered like a paper airplane before landing in a crumpled heap. "You're just like her," David spat. "I never wanted you. I never wanted a black child. You don't belong in this family." Jason took a step back, as if the words had physically struck him. His mind raced. The man he had looked up to all his life was telling him, in the clearest words possible, that he wasn't wanted, that his very existence was a mistake. "But, Dad, I'm your son. It says it right there. This paper says it. I'm your son, your blood." David's face twisted in disgust. "No, you're not my son. No test, no paper, no lie can change that. You don't look like me, you don't act like me. You don't belong here." Jason's mind was reeling, but before he could speak, David stormed out of the room, leaving him standing in a heap of broken hope. Jason looked down at the crumpled DNA results on the floor. His hands shook as he bent down to pick them up. There was no denying it. The test had confirmed the truth. Jason was David's biological son, despite the fact that he had always known, deep down, that he didn't truly fit in the family. But he had hoped. He had believed that maybe the love and care from his father would be enough to bridge the gap of their differences. He stood there in silence, the weight of rejection settling over him like a cold, heavy blanket. Jason didn't know what to do or where to go. He had always known David held some kind of hatred for him, some unspoken tension, but this was worse than he could have imagined. The sound of David's car engine starting echoed from the driveway, followed by the roar of the tires as they screeched out of the driveway, leaving Jason standing alone in the house. He stumbled to the couch and sat down, staring at the DNA test results in his hands. The rejection was still sinking in. His father's words were like a haunting echo in his mind. Jason felt lost, abandoned, and confused, unsure of how to move forward or what to feel next. The doorbell rang. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? He walked slowly to the door and opened it. Standing there, with a look of concern on his face, was his mother, Linda. She had been at work when all of this had happened. "Jason, what happened?" "I heard yelling," Linda asked, her eyes scanning his face, trying to make sense of his expression. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat tightened as the tears began to fall again, uncontrollably. Linda stepped forward, pulling her son into her arms. "What's wrong, baby? What happened?" Jason's voice cracked as he whispered, "He rejected me, Mom. Dad rejected me. He said I wasn't his son, that I wasn't wanted." Linda's face fell, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh, Jason," her voice trembled as she held him tighter, unsure of how to comfort him. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." "Why, Mom? Why did he do that?" Jason asked, his voice small. "What did I do? Why doesn't he want me?" Linda didn't have an answer. She had always known David harbored some racist beliefs, but she had never imagined it would go this far. She had hoped that Jason's relationship with his father would improve with time, but now it seemed like there was no hope left. Jason pulled away from her arms, wiping his eyes. I thought maybe it would be different now. I thought maybe the test would prove that I belong." Linda sat down beside him, taking his hand. "Jason, you've always belonged. Don't let what he said define who you are. You are my son, and you are loved." But as much as Jason wanted to believe her, his heart still ached. David's words had cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. How could someone who had been so close to him, someone who was supposed to love him unconditionally, reject him so easily? "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Mom?" Jason asked, his voice soft. Linda sighed, her eyes filled with sadness. "I didn't want to hurt you, and I didn't want you to feel like you were different. But now you know, and I need you to understand none of this is your fault." Jason nodded slowly, his mind still whirling. The pain was raw, and he didn't know how to process it. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen. It was a text from his best friend Marcus. "Yo, are you okay? Heard about what happened with your dad. Hit me up when you can." Jason's fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to reach out to Marcus, to talk to someone who understood him, but at the same time he felt so lost. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling, and he didn't want to burden his friend with this new weight. The door slammed open suddenly. Jason's heart jumped as David stormed back into the house. He stood in the doorway, glaring at Jason with an expression of pure fury. "You better get out of my house, boy," David snarled. "I'm done with you. Don't even think about coming back." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the rage radiating off his father. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was something darker, something unforgivable. The words felt like a punch to his gut. How had everything gone so wrong so fast? Jason opened his mouth to say something, but his throat went dry. There was no point in arguing. David had made up his mind, and Jason knew there was nothing he could say to change it. As David walked toward the door, Jason felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. What was he supposed to do now? Where would he go? What was going to happen next? But before Jason could react, David slammed the door behind him, leaving Jason standing in the living room, lost and alone. What would Jason do now? Would he fight for his father's love, or would he find a way to move on without him? The answer hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Jason stood frozen in the living room, the sharp sound of the door slamming echoing in his ears. His father's words still rang in his head. "Get out of my house, boy." The phrase cut deep, far deeper than anything Jason had ever imagined. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but the confusion and pain were overwhelming. He glanced at his mother, who had stepped back, her face pale with shock. She was still processing what had just happened, but it was clear that she too was struggling with the reality of the situation. Jason turned his back on the door, trying to block out the sound of it as he sunk onto the couch. The tears that had been threatening to spill earlier finally broke free. His mother walked slowly over to him, sitting down beside him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, but neither of them spoke for several moments. Jason didn't know what to say. What could he possibly say in this moment? What was there to say when your own father, the man who raised you, rejected you so completely? "Jason," Linda said softly, her voice trembling. "I wish I could change what just happened. I don't know why he said those things. I don't know why he's acting this way, but please know that it's not your fault." Jason wiped his eyes, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow. "It doesn't make sense, Mom. He's my dad. He's supposed to love me. He's supposed to want me." Linda shook her head. I know, and this is all my fault. I should have seen it coming. I should have done something earlier." Jason looked at her, confused. "What do you mean, Mom? What do you mean you should have done something earlier?" Linda sighed, her eyes filled with regret. "When I met your father, he had certain ideas, certain beliefs. He grew up in a place where people like you, people who aren't white, were looked down upon. I thought we could work through it. I thought we could raise you to be proud of who you are, to love yourself. But I was wrong. I never thought it would go this far." Jason sat in silence, his head spinning. He had always known there was tension between his father and his identity, but he never imagined it would reach this point. His mother continued, her voice trembling. "He used to tell me that it didn't matter where you came from, that you were still his son. But over the years, I saw little things. The way he looked at people of color, the way he treated them differently. I should have left him then. I should have protected you from that. But I didn't." Jason felt the weight of her words press down on him. "You didn't know what he'd do," he said softly. "But I don't understand. Why didn't he ever say anything to me? Why did he wait until now?" Linda looked away, her face sad. "I think he convinced himself that if he kept quiet, it wouldn't be a problem. But I guess it was always there, and when the DNA test confirmed it, when he couldn't deny it anymore, that's when the truth came out." Jason's thoughts were spinning, each thought darker than the last. What did it mean for him now? Was everything he had known up to this point just a lie? Could he really continue to live in this house with a man who saw him as nothing more than an unwanted mistake? "Where do I go from here?" Jason whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do I do now, Mom? Where do I even belong?" Linda took a deep breath and pulled him close. "You belong with me, Jason. You belong here. You've always belonged, and you'll always have a place with me, no matter what." But Jason wasn't sure if he could believe that anymore. It wasn't just David's rejection that hurt. It was the way it made Jason question everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. As the night wore on, Linda did her best to comfort him, but Jason felt numb. He barely ate dinner, hardly spoke. The weight of his father's rejection pressed heavily on his chest, and it felt like he couldn't breathe. Later that night, after Linda had gone to bed, Jason sat alone in the living room, the silence almost suffocating. He picked up his phone, wanting to reach out to Marcus, but the text from earlier still sat unanswered in his messages. "Yo, are you okay? Heard about what happened with your dad. Hit me up when you can." Jason thought about it for a long moment before typing out a response. "I don't know, Marcus. I don't know what's going on anymore. Everything feels wrong." He stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for a response, but the phone remained silent, the message sitting there unanswered. It made him feel more alone than ever. Jason finally stood up, pacing around the room. He was angry, confused, hurt. He had always believed that love would overcome anything, that no matter how hard things got, his father would always be there for him. But now it felt like everything had crumbled in a single instant. He turned toward the window, staring out at the street beyond. He couldn't see much in the dark, but he could feel the weight of the emptiness outside. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. "Jason, I don't know what's going on, but I'm here for you, man. You need to talk, I got you." Jason felt a little comfort in the words, but it didn't take away the ache in his chest. He needed more than words. He needed answers. He needed to understand why his father had done this. The next day, Jason didn't go to work. He couldn't bring himself to leave the house. The rejection still weighed heavily on him, making it hard to focus on anything else. When Linda came into the living room in the morning, she found him sitting in the same spot where he had been the night before, staring at nothing in particular. "Jason," she said softly, "what are you thinking?" He looked at her, his eyes dull. "I don't know, Mom. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore." Linda sighed, sitting down beside him. "We'll figure this out, okay? I'll help you figure it out." But Jason wasn't sure if he believed that. Could anyone help him now? Could anything ever be the same again after what had happened? He stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. He needed space. He needed to get out of this house, even if it was just for a little while. "I'm going for a walk," Jason said quietly. "I just need to clear my head." Linda watched him go but didn't stop him. She knew he needed time, even as she didn't understand exactly what he was feeling. Jason walked out into the cold morning air, hoping that the walk would give him some clarity, some sense of peace. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the image of his father's face, the anger in his eyes as he told Jason that he wasn't his son. Jason's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing. It was Marcus. "Jason, where are you? What's going on? You okay?" Jason paused, looking down at the screen. Part of him wanted to break down and tell Marcus everything. The pain, the hurt, the rejection. But another part of him was afraid. Afraid that no matter what he said, nothing would change. "I'm out for a walk, Marcus. Just need some space." Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. "Okay, I get it. But listen, when you're ready, I'm here. Don't forget that." Jason couldn't find the words to respond. He just nodded to himself as he hung up, the cold air stinging his face. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive his father for what he had done. But one thing was certain. Things were never going to be the same. Jason walked for what felt like hours, his feet carrying him aimlessly through the quiet streets. The chill of the early morning air nipped at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was too clouded with anger, confusion, and a hollow emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing step. His father's words kept echoing in his head. "You're not my son." He had heard them before in arguments and offhanded comments, but now they were sharper, more cutting. The more he thought about it, the more he couldn't understand. David had always been distant, always a little cold when it came to Jason's race. But Jason had convinced himself that it was just old habits, old prejudices, things that didn't matter in the face of family. But now, with the rejection so final, so forceful, all those little signs made sense. All those moments when his father had looked at him like he was something less, something other, suddenly came rushing back. Jason stopped at a small park, the swings swaying gently in the breeze, their creaks the only sound breaking the silence of the morning. He sat down on one of the benches, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He didn't know where to go next. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Marcus. "Dude, you good? Wanna talk?" Jason stared at the screen for a long time before typing a response. "I don't know, man. I don't know anything anymore." He stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, willing the right words to come to him, but nothing did. He didn't want to burden Marcus with all of this. Marcus wasn't his therapist. He was his friend. But right now, Jason felt like he was drowning in all the emotions he didn't know how to deal with. "I'm gonna try and talk to Mom later," he added finally, but even as he sent the message, he wasn't sure if he could bring himself to talk to her. He didn't know what to say to her either. What did she expect him to do? Was she really just going to let it go like David had done nothing wrong? Jason's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up in front of the park. He didn't even have to look to know it was his mother. He could always recognize the sound of her old Subaru, the one she had driven since before Jason was born. Linda stepped out of the car, her face drawn, looking more tired than Jason had ever seen her. She hadn't expected to find him here. "Jason," she said softly, walking toward him. "I've been looking for you." Jason didn't know what to say. He just stared at her for a moment before finally standing up from the bench and walking toward her. He couldn't help the wave of frustration and sadness that hit him again. "Why didn't you stop him, Mom? Why didn't you do something?" Jason's voice cracked as he spoke, his emotions overwhelming him again. "Why didn't you see this coming? You've always known how he felt, and you never warned me. I've been living a lie." Linda's face softened as she reached out to touch his arm. "I didn't want you to feel different, Jason. I didn't want you to feel like you didn't belong. I thought, no, I hoped, that if I gave you the love you deserved, if I showed you how much you were wanted, it wouldn't matter what anyone else thought." Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "It's too late for that now, isn't it? He's already made up his mind. He's already pushed me away." "Jason." Linda's voice faltered, and for a moment, it seemed like she might break down herself. "I never wanted you to go through this, but I can't change what's happened. I can only tell you that I love you, and that no matter what your father says or does, you are my son, and you always will be." Jason felt the anger building again, but this time it was not just at his father. It was at himself, at the whole situation. Why had he ever believed that love could fix everything? Why had he allowed himself to get his hopes up, to think that David could change? "Why didn't you leave him?" Jason asked suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you leave when you saw what he was really like?" Linda flinched at his words, and Jason immediately regretted them. She had stayed. She had stayed because she loved him, and Jason knew that. But the question hung in the air between them like a poison. "I didn't want to break up our family, Jason. I thought things would get better, that your father would come around. But now I don't know." Linda's voice trailed off, and she stood there for a long time, looking at the ground. Jason didn't know what to say. He could feel the distance between them growing, just like he felt it between himself and his father. It was a rift that he didn't know how to bridge, and part of him wasn't sure he even wanted to try anymore. Finally, after what felt like hours of silence, Linda spoke again. "Do you want to come home, Jason? Or do you want to stay here a little longer?" Jason didn't answer right away. He didn't want to go back to the house. He didn't want to face his father again, not after the way he had been rejected. But he also didn't want to be alone. "I'll come with you," he said quietly. They drove back in silence. Jason stared out the window, trying to process everything that had happened. But the more he thought about it, the more hopeless everything seemed. He had never felt this lost before. The world felt like it was shifting under his feet, and he didn't know how to find his balance again. When they got home, Linda made them both some tea, hoping the warm drink would settle the tension that had taken over their small house. Jason sat at the kitchen table, his mind still on everything his father had said. He couldn't stop replaying the words over and over in his head. "You don't belong in this family." Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this rejection wasn't just about him. It wasn't about the DNA test or the color of his skin. It was about something much deeper, something that David had buried inside him for years. But why had it come out now? Just then, Jason's phone buzzed again. It was Marcus. "Yo, you home? If you need to talk, I'm here. Don't keep it all inside, man." Jason stared at the message for a moment, feeling the weight of the words pressing on his chest. Could he talk to Marcus about all of this? Could he tell him how he was feeling? How lost he felt? Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. Jason's heart skipped a beat. It was early, and he didn't expect anyone to be visiting. He exchanged a glance with his mother, who stood up to answer it. When she opened the door, Jason could see her stiffen, her expression darkening as she faced whoever was standing there. "David," she said quietly, "what are you doing here?" Jason stood up immediately, his heart racing. He had a feeling this wouldn't go well. He wasn't sure if he was ready for another confrontation. He certainly wasn't ready to face his father again, not so soon after the things that had been said. David's voice was cold when he spoke. "I need to talk to Jason." Jason's throat tightened as he walked toward the door. This was it. The moment he had feared, the moment that would determine whether or not his relationship with his father was really over. Jason stood at the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected his father to show up here, not after what had happened the night before. He had assumed David would go silent, as he usually did after a fight, shutting himself off from everything. But yet he was, standing in the doorway, looking as cold and distant as ever. Jason didn't want to face him. He didn't want to hear any more lies, any more justifications. The rejection had already been more than he could handle. But David was standing there, and there was no getting away from it now. Linda stepped back, her face a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. "David, I don't know what you're trying to do, but Jason doesn't need to hear anything more from you right now." David's gaze flickered to Linda for a brief moment before returning to Jason. His voice was sharp, his words clipped. "I don't care what you think, Linda. This is between me and him." Jason's stomach twisted. He wanted to shout to tell his father to leave, but he held himself back. What was the point? No matter what he said, David had made up his mind about him, and no amount of pleading would change that. David stepped past Linda, who didn't try to stop him. The tension in the room grew thick, suffocating. "Jason, we need to talk." "Now," David said, his voice cold but not without a hint of urgency. Jason opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. The words felt too heavy, like rocks in his throat. Instead, he just nodded silently, stepping aside to let his father in. His mind raced with questions. What was this about? Did he come here to apologize, or was this another attempt to push him away? David didn't waste any time. He walked into the living room and stood in the middle of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Jason watched him warily, unsure of what was coming next. David cleared his throat before speaking. "I made a mistake, Jason. A big one." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Was this an apology? His mind couldn't process it fast enough. The last time they spoke, David had been so cruel, so angry, that Jason hadn't expected anything other than more rejection. But then David continued, and Jason's hope faded just as quickly. "I should have never let you take that test. I should have stopped you before it ever got this far," David said, his voice low and tense. "But now that it's out there, we both know the truth. I don't care what that paper says, Jason. I'm not going to pretend everything's fine when it's not. You're not like me. You never will be." Jason's stomach dropped. It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under him. His father wasn't apologizing, he was doubling down. He could feel the anger rising inside him, bubbling up from somewhere deep. "Stop," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. "Stop talking. Just stop. I don't want to hear it anymore." David ignored him. "You think you've been rejected, don't you? Well, that's not it, Jason. It's just, you don't belong here. You never have." He paused, searching for the right words, but there was no kindness, no empathy in his eyes. "You're not what I wanted. I tried, I really did. But now I see the truth. It's too late." Jason's chest tightened with pain. But now he was angry, furious. The tears that had been threatening to fall since last night felt like they might finally spill over, but they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of frustration and rage. "You think I wanted this?" Jason shouted, his voice breaking. "You think I wanted to feel like this? To be the son you never wanted? The son who doesn't look like you, doesn't act like you?" David didn't flinch at the outburst. He just stood there, his face expressionless. "I don't know why you're making this such a big deal, Jason. It's the truth. You need to face it." Jason's vision blurred with tears, but he didn't care. He was done trying to appease this man, done hoping for a father who would ever love him the way he deserved. "I never asked for your love," Jason said, his voice sharp with bitterness. "I never asked for you to pretend to be someone you weren't, but you don't get to treat me like this. Not anymore." The silence between them was deafening. David's eyes were cold, calculating, but Jason didn't care anymore. His father's rejection was the worst pain he'd ever felt, but had also made him realize something else. He was stronger than this. He didn't need David's approval. He didn't need anyone who couldn't accept him for who he was. Linda, who had been standing in the doorway, watching the exchange silently, finally spoke up. "David, enough. You're only making this worse." David turned to face her, his jaw tight with anger. "You don't get it, Linda. You've been blind to this for years. You've kept him sheltered from the truth. Well, Nami has to face it, just like I did." Jason could see the crack in his mother's resolve, the pain she was trying so hard to hide. She was torn, caught between the man she had married and the son she loved. "I never sheltered him from anything," Linda said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I just wanted him to be happy, to feel loved. And this is how you treat him." David didn't respond. He stood there, rigid, silent, as if the words weren't worth his time. Jason couldn't take it anymore. He turned toward the door, walking toward it without looking back. He needed air. He needed to get out to escape this suffocating, broken situation. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, his father's voice stopped him. "Where do you think you're going?" David asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Jason's hand paused on the door, his fingers gripping the handle tightly. He didn't turn around. "I'm leaving. I can't be here right now. I can't listen to you anymore." "Don't you dare walk out that door," David snapped, his voice filled with venom. "This is my house. You don't get to make the rules." Jason's pulse quickened. He was done with this. He was done with trying to understand his father, done with trying to make him see reason. He opened the door, his words coming out in a rush, his anger giving him the strength he didn't know he had. "It may be your house, but you don't get to control me anymore. You're not my father. Not anymore." Jason slammed the door behind him before either of them could say anything more. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what to do next. But he couldn't stay in that house, not with his father still there, still spitting hatred and rejection. He had to leave, for good. As he walked out into the cool evening air, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. His heart ached, but for the first time in a long time, Jason felt a sense of freedom, a sense of control. He didn't need David. He didn't need a man who could turn his back on him so easily. Jason wasn't sure where he would go. He didn't have a plan, and he didn't care. All he knew was that he was done. Done with the lies, done with the rejection, done with a family that couldn't accept him. And for the first time in his life, Jason felt like he was finally beginning to understand who he was. But as he walked down the dark street, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Marcus. "Where are you, bro? I'm worried." Jason stopped walking for a moment, looking down at the screen. A lump formed in his throat. He had no idea how to explain everything that had just happened. But he knew deep down that it was time to tell someone the truth. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus would be the first person who could help him pick up the pieces. Jason stood there, the dim light from a nearby street lamp flickering in the distance as he stared at his phone. Marcus's message was sitting there, an unanswered plea for him to reach out. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him. His best friend had no idea what was happening, no clue about the words that had been thrown at him. The rejection, the cruel way his father had pushed him away. It was too much to explain in a text. But Marcus deserved the truth. Jason knew that. He couldn't keep running from this, not anymore. Taking a deep breath, Jason typed out a response. "I'm sorry, man, I can't explain it all right now, but I need you. Can you come meet me?" A few seconds passed before Marcus replied. "Of course, where are you?" Jason glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The streets were unfamiliar, and he realized he didn't have a clear plan for where to go. He had just walked, letting his legs carry him wherever the emotions led. "I'm by the old park on 5th. I'll wait here." Jason sat on a nearby bench, pulling his knees up to his chest. The cool breeze blew through his hair, but it didn't bring any relief from the heaviness in his heart. He wasn't sure what to expect from Marcus. Could anyone really understand what he was going through right now? How could he explain something so personal, so painful, when he barely understood it himself? A few minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed down the street, growing louder until Marcus appeared in the glow of the street lamp. He looked around, spotting Jason right away, his face lighting up with relief. "Yo," Marcus said, his voice softer than usual, his concern obvious. He had a way of talking that made Jason feel like everything was going to be okay, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. "What's going on, man? You good?" Jason shook his head, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He wasn't good. He was anything but he couldn't lie to Marcus. Not anymore. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had been holding everything in for so long, pretending like things were fine, pretending like his family was perfect. But now, with Marcus standing there, waiting for an answer, Jason couldn't hold it back any longer. "My dad." Jason's voice cracked, and for a moment, he thought he might not be able to finish. But he had to. He had to tell Marcus. "He rejected me, man. He told me I wasn't his son. He said I didn't belong in this family." Marcus's face softened, and he stepped closer, sitting beside Jason on the bench. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Marcus didn't push him for more information, didn't try to make it better with some cliché phrase. He just sat there quiet, giving Jason the space to process. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. Why? Why would he say that? Jason let out a shaky breath. He could barely explain it himself. How could he expect Marcus to understand? But he had to try. "Because of the DNA test," Jason muttered. "I found out I'm not his biological son." He freaked out, said I wasn't like him, that I never would be. Marcus frowned. But you're still his son, Jason. I mean, that's just a test. A piece of paper. That doesn't change who you are, who he raised you to be. Jason nodded slowly, but the doubt lingered. I wish it was that simple, Marcus, but the way he looked at me, it was like he saw a stranger. Like I wasn't even his son anymore. He wiped his eyes, trying to push away the tears that were threatening to fall. I didn't know what to do. He said it wasn't just the test, that I'm not like him, that I'll never be like him. Marcus was silent for a moment, his eyes looking out at the darkened park. The quiet made Jason feel exposed, but it also gave him a strange sense of comfort. Man, I can't even imagine what that feels like, Marcus said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. But your dad, he's wrong. If he really thinks a piece of paper changes who you are, then he's the one who doesn't get it. You're you, you've always been you. It doesn't matter where you come from. Not to me, not to anyone who cares about you. Jason felt a lump in his throat. He had heard people say things like that before, but hearing it from Marcus, his best friend, made it feel real for the first time. He hadn't felt this much support in years. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that not everyone would turn their back on him. Thanks, Marcus, Jason whispered, grateful beyond words. But I don't know if I can ever fix this with him. He's made up his mind. Marcus shook his head. I don't think you need to fix anything. He's the one who's messed up, not you. You're not the problem here. Don't let him make you think that you are. Jason let out a deep breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, he started to believe it. He wasn't the problem. His father was. But how did he come to terms with that? How did he move on knowing that the man who should have loved him unconditionally was willing to throw it all away? There was a long pause, the kind that felt like an eternity. Jason stared out at the empty swings in the park, the quiet sound of the chains swaying back and forth in the wind. I don't know what to do next, Marcus, Jason admitted. I feel lost, like everything I knew has just disappeared. Marcus's voice softened. Then you take it one step at a time, man. One day at a time. You've got people who care about you. You've got me. And whatever happens with your dad, it doesn't change that. Jason felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He hadn't expected Marcus to understand everything. He didn't even understand it all himself, but just hearing those words helped to ease the crushing weight that had settled on his chest. Before Jason could say anything else, his phone buzzed again. He glanced down at it, surprised to see a message from his mom. Jason, I know you're upset. Please come home. We need to talk. Jason felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What now? Was his mom really trying to fix this? Was she hoping that everything would just go back to normal? Marcus saw the hesitation on his face. You should go. If you feel like you need to, go talk to her. Maybe you can start figuring things out. Jason looked up at his best friend, unsure of what to do. Could he face his mom after everything? Could he handle another conversation with David lingering in the background? He stood up, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. I'll go, but I'm not sure what to say. You don't have to have all the answers, Marcus said with a small smile. Just take it one step at a time. You don't need to solve everything right now. Jason nodded slowly, feeling a little lighter than he had in days. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe all he had to do was take it one step at a time. As he began to walk toward the direction of home, he felt a mix of fear and resolve in his chest. There was no going back to what things had been, but maybe there was a way forward, a way to find peace with what was happening. But as he walked, another message came in, this one from his father. This is your last chance to make things right. Don't make me regret this. Jason froze. The message felt like a threat, cold and calculated. He wasn't sure what David meant, but he knew that he couldn't keep running from it anymore. This was it. He had to face his father. But what did that mean for him? What would it mean for their family? The questions swirled in his mind as he walked toward the house, the weight of everything hanging in the air. And as he reached the door, he had no idea what he was walking into next. Jason stood at the door, staring at the message from his father. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms sweaty. The words on the screen burned into his mind. This is your last chance to make things right. Don't make me regret this. What did that even mean? What did David want? After everything he'd said, after everything he'd done, Jason couldn't understand how this message was supposed to make him feel. It felt like another ultimatum, another attempt to control him. But part of him still hoped that maybe, just maybe, his father was reaching out because he regretted the things he had said. Jason hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had already walked out once. Was he ready to go back in? Ready to face his father and his past again? His phone buzzed once more. It was his mother. Please come inside. We need to talk. Jason looked up at the house, its lights casting a warm glow through the windows. The house that once felt like home now seemed like a cage. He could hear his mother's voice in his head, pleading with him, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to walk back into that place, into that broken world. Everything feels wrong, Jason muttered under his breath. How did we get here? He felt a hand on his shoulder, and he turned to see Marcus standing beside him. His friend had followed him home, not saying a word, just offering his silent support. You don't have to do this alone, Marcus said softly. But you don't have to do it at all if you don't want to. It's your decision. Jason looked at him for a long moment. Marcus was right. No one could force him to do anything. He had spent so much time trying to make his family love him, trying to fix what was broken. But maybe it wasn't up to him to fix it. Maybe he needed to stop letting the past define him. Jason's mind flashed to everything that had happened. The DNA test, the painful words from his father, the moment he had walked out and found himself free of that toxic grip. It was a freedom he hadn't felt in years, but now standing here, the reality of his fractured family loomed large in front of him. His father still wanted him to come back, still wanted him to conform to his idea of who Jason should be. Jason closed his eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, he made his decision. I don't know what's going to happen when I go in there, he said quietly. But I can't keep living like this, like I'm some mistake. I'm done trying to prove myself to him. Marcus nodded, his expression full of understanding. Whatever happens, you're not alone. You've got me. You've got people who love you for who you are, not for who you're supposed to be. Jason smiled faintly, grateful for Marcus's words. As much as he still felt lost, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. And maybe that was all he really needed right now. He turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The familiar scent of his home greeted him, but it felt different now. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, but Jason felt strangely detached from it. He wasn't the same person who had stormed out last night. He had changed. Linda was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. She looked up when Jason entered, her face softening with relief. "Jason," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I know this has been so hard on you, but please come sit. We need to talk." Jason didn't sit. He couldn't. He needed to stand, needed to keep moving forward. "I don't know what to say, Mom. I don't even know where to start." "You don't have to say anything," Linda whispered. Just know that I'm sorry, and I'm here for you, no matter what." Jason felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that things could be fixed. But he couldn't just forget what his father had said, couldn't just pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Jason looked up. David appeared in the doorway, his face expressionless. For a moment, the room was filled with an unbearable silence. David's eyes met Jason's, and there was something cold in them, something distant. "I don't know what you think you're going to fix here, Jason," David said in a low voice. "But you've got to understand, this isn't going to change. You're not the son I thought I had." Jason felt a sharp sting in his chest, but he didn't flinch. "You can't keep doing this, Dad. You can't keep pushing me away and expecting me to just come back. I'm not going to be the person you want me to be, and I'm done trying to be." David opened his mouth to respond, but Jason wasn't going to let him speak over him again. "All my life, I tried to make you proud. I've tried to fit into your world. But the truth is, I'm not you. And I don't want to be. I'm me. And if you can't accept that, then maybe it's time for us to go our separate ways." Jason's voice wavered, but he stood firm. David's expression hardened, but for a split second, Jason saw a flicker of something. Guilt? Regret? It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same coldness Jason had come to know all too well. "Fine," David said, his voice flat. "If that's how you feel, then go ahead. But don't come back to me when you realize you made a mistake." Jason shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I won't make that mistake. Not again." Without another word, Jason turned and walked toward the door. This time, he didn't hesitate. He stepped outside into the cool evening air, the door closing softly behind him. He didn't look back. Marcus was still waiting for him, standing at the end of the driveway. His face was full of concern, but when he saw Jason, he relaxed slightly. "How did it go?" Marcus asked. Jason took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "It went exactly how I thought it would," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet pain. "But I'm done trying to change things. I can't fix my dad, I can only fix myself." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "And that's enough. You're enough, Jason." Jason looked up at the night sky, the stars scattered across the black canvas. It felt like a weight had been lifted, but also like something important had been lost. He wasn't sure what the future held, whether his relationship with his father would ever heal, or if he could ever truly feel accepted by his family. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his road to walk. No longer defined by his father's expectations or the cruelty of rejection, Jason was ready to move forward one step at a time. And as he walked with Marcus by his side, he felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The future was his to shape.